The CEO was about to sign the divorce, but she asked for one last date and the shocking truth was revealed. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now subscribe to the channel and let's get started. Emily perched on the edge of a stiff leather chair, anxiously tapping her foot against the tiled floor. The receptionist's sympathetic smile did little to ease the knot in her stomach, and the distant hum of traffic through the tall windows only intensified the hush. Across from her, James stared at the floor with a hollow gaze, arms folded over the crisp fabric of his suit. Neither of them had expected to be here, a modern office building downtown, waiting in heavy silence for the final blow to a bond they once cherished. When the lawyer appeared and gestured for them to follow, Emily felt a dull ache in her chest. They filed into a conference room lined with neat shelves of legal books. A single stack of papers lay in front of two pristine pens. The hum of the air conditioner took on a droning quality, filling the room with a low undertone that seemed to press on her ears. She noticed James hesitate before stepping up to the table, his gaze flickering from the documents to her face. His features had hardened over the last few weeks, frown lines deepened, and a tense set to his jaw betrayed his own unease. The lawyer began outlining the proceedings in a calm, measured tone, describing the significance of each section they were meant to sign. Terms like final separation and property division blurred in Emily's mind. She couldn't stop thinking about the day they'd exchanged vows in front of friends and family, sure that their love was unbreakable. It felt surreal to be in this place, confronted by the wreckage of their former life. James reached for one of the pens first, signing where indicated. The scratch of ink on paper sounded impossibly loud. Emily studied his face and detected the smallest hesitation in his eyes, as if part of him questioned this irreversible step. She tried to swallow the lump in her throat, but her voice emerged in a near whisper when she spoke. "Do you remember that trip to the cabin in late autumn?" she asked, glancing at the lawyer who briefly paused his routine. "We thought it would be a disaster because of the rain, but it turned out to be one of our favorite weekends." James's hand froze above the page. He looked at her, a flicker of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I remember," he said quietly. "We almost got stuck on that muddy road near the lake." Their brief exchange died in the stuffy air as the lawyer resumed flipping pages. Emily felt her heart pounding, unsure if she wanted to cling to these memories or let them go. The tension in her shoulders made her want to scream, but she forced herself to stay calm. She lifted the pen, ready to sign, when a surge of panic rushed through her. The thought of leaving everything behind, the thought of never knowing if they'd done enough to save what once was beautiful, jolted her into speaking again. "Wait," her voice cracked. "Before we do this, could we—" She met James's eyes, ignoring the mild confusion on the lawyer's face. "Could we have just one last night together? I'm not saying we have to fix anything, I can't leave all these years behind without at least giving ourselves a chance to talk. Properly." James's face registered surprise, and for a moment he said nothing. The lawyer, sensing the thick emotion in the room, discreetly closed his folder to give them a moment's privacy. Emily noticed how James's breathing seemed shallow, almost as if he was stifling a wave of conflicting thoughts. She pictured the nights they had spent apart recently, each waiting for the other to reach out, neither willing to cross the chasm of pride and misunderstanding. Eventually, James exhaled and placed the pen down. "One night?" he echoed, sounding uncertain. He cleared his throat. "I don't really see the point, Em, but if it means you can feel some closure." "Okay." Relief washed over her, though it brought an undercurrent of sadness, too. She'd hoped he might be more enthusiastic, but perhaps exhaustion ran deeper than she'd realized. The lawyer discreetly opened his folder again and gathered the unsigned pages, nodding in acknowledgement that they'd return in the morning. He explained that both parties would need to sign by the following afternoon or reschedule the final hearing. Emily thanked him, feeling a tightness in her chest only slightly loosen. They walked out of the conference room into a bright hallway. Their footsteps echoed on the polished floor, the tension between them almost tangible. Emily didn't dare let hope blossom too much. She knew this last night might only be a formality, one final goodbye before they tied up loose ends in front of the law. Outside the lawyer's office, they lingered by the reception desk, unsure of who should speak first. The lawyer, still holding the documents, offered a polite smile. "You both seemed certain before," he commented gently. "But sometimes stepping back can help. I'll see you tomorrow." When he disappeared behind another door, Emily and James stood face to face. He slipped his hands into his pockets and glanced at the floor, hesitating to meet her eyes. She felt a stabbing regret over all the silent nights, all the small arguments and misunderstandings that had piled up until they nearly suffocated the love they once had. But there was a faint warmth in the way he finally looked at her, as if he recognized that maybe they'd both been too ready to let go. They headed for the elevators. The silence between them felt loaded with memories both painful and sweet. At the end of the hallway, they paused in front of the closing elevator doors, stepping inside as the fluorescent lights reflected on the polished metal walls. Emily pressed the button for the ground floor, and James leaned against the opposite wall, arms still crossed but no longer hostile. "You took me by surprise in there," he admitted, voice subdued. "I thought we'd just finalize everything." She glanced down at her shoes. "I thought that's what I wanted too, but I couldn't do it, not yet." He nodded, lips pressed into a thin line. When the doors opened, they emerged into a lobby bustling with other professionals, men and women in suits, voices echoing off the marble floors. Bright sunshine spilled through the glass walls, casting the world outside in a stark clarity that made it hard to hide from reality. Together, they stepped out onto the sidewalk. There, a short argument erupted. Perhaps it was the tension built over months of misunderstandings, or the shared confusion about what this night could possibly change. Their voices started low and urgent, building as they flung resentments at each other, old wounds flaring up in the harsh daylight. People passing on the street eyed them briefly, but neither Emily nor James paid any mind. At one point, Emily's frustration peaked. "Why didn't you ever just tell me what was going on with you? We used to talk about everything." She could see the pain flash across James's eyes, almost as if she'd hit a nerve he hadn't wanted exposed. "I tried," he shot back, his voice cracking. "You think I wanted things to end like this? You think I enjoy not being able to—" He stopped himself, swallowing hard, his next words trailing off into the street noise. "I don't want to fight in front of all these people," he whispered finally, closing his eyes in a brief moment of defeat. They fell quiet, standing side by side as the bustle of the city continued around them. After a moment, Emily broke the silence softly. "I appreciate you giving me one more night. I don't know what it'll change, if anything, but it feels right to at least try." James nodded, wiping a hand over his brow. He looked away, almost as if wrestling with some internal ache. "Let's just get through it," he muttered, though his tone held no real anger. Emily exhaled. A light breeze rustled a nearby tree, and she wondered if it was the last moment of calm they might share. A small part of her bristled with curiosity at the way James grimaced now and then, as if something more than the stress of the divorce was weighing on him. But she brushed it aside for the time being, choosing to cling to the slight hope that tonight might bring clarity. They took a few steps away from the office building, moving into the bright midday sun. Emily paused to say something, but her words fell away when she noticed James wincing, fingers pressing gently against his temple. He tried to hide it, flashing an almost apologetic look, but it was too late. She'd already seen his discomfort. A sense of unease washed over her. Maybe there was more going on than he was admitting. She felt an unexplained surge of protectiveness flood through her, though she kept quiet. They'd agreed on this one night, and she wanted to see if there was any fragment of their marriage left to salvage. Yet the pang of worry in her gut kept twisting, warning her that something else was at stake. She opened her mouth to ask if he felt all right, but he broke away, turning to walk toward the corner where his car was parked. Left momentarily behind, Emily stared at his retreating figure, nerves humming with suspicion. Then she followed him, determined to find answers. Emily steps outside into the sunlight, turning back to see James wincing in discomfort. For a split second, she senses something deeper is wrong, and wonders if this final night might reveal more than either of them expects. Emily stood on the sidewalk, shaking off the lingering tension from the lawyer's office. She couldn't ignore the pinch in her chest whenever she glanced at James, who walked a few paces away, massaging the side of his temple. The noise of midday traffic washed over them, and a crisp wind rustled the paperwork tucked under Emily's arm, reminders of the divorce that was almost finalized. Despite the swirl of unease, she found herself inching closer to him. "Hey," she said softly, reaching out a tentative hand. "Are you sure you're okay? You looked like you were in pain back there." James straightened, dropping his hand from his head. "I'm fine," he replied, but his voice lacked conviction. He stared at a passing bus as if it might offer a distraction. "It's just a headache. Not a big deal." Emily frowned. A dozen questions rose to the tip of her tongue, but she forced them back. They had already decided on one last date, though calling it a date felt strange with the looming reality of the divorce. She cleared her throat and tried to muster some courage. "So, let's not put this off, okay?" she ventured, attempting a calm demeanor. "We said one last night, I still want that." His eyes flicked to hers, guarded, uncertain. "Dinner tonight?" he asked in a low voice. It sounded almost like a challenge, as if he wanted her to think twice about it. But Emily nodded, refusing to back down. "Dinner," she confirmed. "Maybe at Luca's. We used to like that place." James lifted an eyebrow but didn't argue. "Luca's," he echoed, sounding as though he were recalling a memory from a different life. "Okay, let's do that." A shrill ring cut through the air. James's phone lit up with an unknown number. He glanced at the screen with a tight jaw, pressing the power button to silence it. Emily's curiosity flared. "Do you need to get that?" she asked, voice carefully measured. He shook his head. "It's nothing urgent." The faint note of tension in his tone suggested otherwise, but he slipped the phone into his pocket, signifying the conversation was over. For a moment they stood in awkward silence. City dwellers bustled around them, weaving through the sidewalk. Emily fought the urge to push him for answers right then and there, but something told her to wait. She offered him a tentative half-smile. "I'll see you tonight at Luca's around 7 then," she said, stepping back. He managed a slight nod. "7 works. Guess we can talk more then." As soon as they agreed, a wave of uncertainty rushed between them. They exchanged a quiet goodbye, turning in opposite directions to head home. Emily's feet carried her briskly toward a nearby subway station. Her mind buzzed with thoughts of that phone call, the way James had pressed a hand to his head, the incomplete feeling of having so many questions but no answers. By the time she reached her apartment, her arms felt heavy with tension. She set the paperwork on the kitchen table, not wanting to think about it just yet. The modest living room felt emptier than usual. With a sigh, she sank onto the couch and unlocked her phone, scrolling through pictures from months and years past, smiling selfies with James at the beach, snapshots of their wedding day, him goofing around on the couch with their cat. It stunned her to realize how quickly things had spiraled into constant arguments and silent nights. Needing to clear her head, she placed the phone aside and looked around the apartment for a distraction. Her eyes landed on a small wooden box nestled on a shelf. It held tokens from their relationship, movie ticket stubs, birthday letters, random souvenirs. She opened it and traced a finger over an old snapshot of them dancing in the living room, the furniture pushed aside so they'd have space to swirl around. An unexpected pang of longing tightened her throat. She stuffed the photo back, shut the lid, and tried to shake off the memories. Whether tonight would be a last farewell or a genuine second chance, she didn't know, but she intended to find out the truth about whatever James was hiding. Meanwhile, James stood alone in his own living room, phone in hand. He glanced at the missed call, the unknown number that he suspected was tied to his endless string of medical consultations. With a grimace, he set the phone on the counter. The overhead light buzzed faintly, adding to his growing headache. A half-empty bottle of prescription pills caught his eye from its place beside the sink. He tapped the bottle, reading the dosage on the label, then set it back down, refusing to let the sight of it derail his thoughts. He couldn't let Emily find out everything, not yet, not while they were both in such a raw, vulnerable place. He exhaled, leaning against the counter. The quiet of the apartment felt suffocating, reminding him of how he'd been sleeping on the couch for weeks before they finally decided to file for divorce. Each day had become an exercise in carefully avoiding conversations that truly mattered. Now it was all crashing down, and he felt unsteady, like a tightrope walker without a net. Nightfall came too quickly for both of them. Emily changed clothes with shaking hands, choosing something simple, a soft sweater and dark jeans. She brushed her hair twice as long as usual, nerves twisting her stomach into knots. At a glance, it felt absurd to fuss over a dinner that might well be the last time she and James shared anything beyond paperwork. Still, when she arrived at Luca's, nostalgia flooded her senses. The warm glow of fairy lights above the patio, the faint scent of oregano and tomato sauce wafting through the entrance, the checkered tablecloths that once made them laugh about old-world charm. A hostess with a bright smile welcomed her, asking, "Table for two?" as though everything were normal. James walked in moments later, looking composed but distracted. The hostess recognized them from better days. "It's been a while," she said, guiding them to a booth by the window. James responded with a polite nod, though his eyes seemed distant. They settled in, the overhead lamp giving off a soft light that highlighted the tension in their faces. The server came by with menus, then left them to their awkward small talk. Emily fiddled with the corner of hers, wishing she could read James's mind. "How was the rest of your day?" she ventured, trying for a neutral topic. He shrugged. "Fine. Took care of some errands." He left out the part where he'd sat in a silent apartment, phone in hand, ignoring a second unknown call. Unspoken tension pulsed between them, thickening the air. Emily cleared her throat. "I've been thinking about how we ended up here. It's like we got so caught in fighting that we forgot how to just be in the same room." James's gaze flicked to the side. "Yeah," he said. "It happened slowly, but at the same time, it feels like it was overnight." The server returned with water and asked if they wanted appetizers. Emily ordered bruschetta, a favorite from way back when they used to come here regularly. James nodded absently, not disputing her choice. Once the server was gone, they lapsed into silence again. Emily couldn't help noticing him touching his forehead now and then, as if fighting off a persistent ache. "Are you sure you're all right?" she asked quietly, leaning forward. "You've been... I don't know. You seem in pain." He hesitated. "Just a headache, really. It's not a big deal." But he offered no further information. When the bruschetta arrived, the server also mentioned the dessert special, spumoni gelato, which had been the go-to treat on Emily and James's honeymoon. They exchanged glances, each remembering that trip to Italy that now felt like a dream they barely recalled. "Should we get it later?" James asked. He gave a half-hearted chuckle. "Might be nice to pretend for a moment that everything's still the same." Emily nodded, forcing a smile. They managed a few light moments over the bruschetta, sharing small talk about the funnier anecdotes of their past, like the time they accidentally ended up on a train to the wrong city in Italy. For a fleeting second, Emily felt genuine warmth stirring in her chest, the memory of how effortlessly they used to laugh. Then James's phone buzzed in the middle of their conversation. He glanced down at the screen, stiffening. Emily glimpsed the words, "Test results," in the brief preview before he hastily turned the phone face down on the table. Her pulse spiked with alarm. "What test results?" she asked, trying to keep her tone calm. He shifted uncomfortably. "It's nothing." He looked away, biting his lip. "I don't want to get into it right now." "James?" Her voice wavered, equal parts worry and frustration. "I'm not an idiot. You've been getting these strange calls all day. Is it something serious?" He stared at the flickering candle on the table, refusing to meet her eyes. Silence stretched, and Emily's mind whirred with possibilities. Was it something to do with his health? Finances? She felt shut out again, that old barrier of secrets stacking up between them. A tension-laden moment later, James set the phone aside. "I don't want to ruin tonight by going into it," he muttered. "Can we just drop it for now?" Emily exhaled shakily, wanting to press him but also not wanting to escalate into another fight. She decided to let it slide, at least until they made it through the meal. They ate in near silence, the occasional clink of cutlery filling the void. Dessert arrived, spumoni gelato, melting around the edges. The taste was both sweet and bitter, reminding Emily of a time they would have happily shared one cup with 2 spoons. By the end of dinner, they both seemed worn down. Emily felt like she'd been pushing against an invisible wall all night, trying to breach the distance James erected. He stood first, grabbing the check. She insisted on splitting it, if only to maintain a sense of independence. He didn't protest. Outside, the world had grown darker, the restaurant's warm light spilling onto the sidewalk. They walked toward their cars, side by side but not quite in step. Emily wrestled with the urge to ask him one more time about the phone calls, about the headaches, about why he seemed so troubled beneath the surface. Yet she held back, unsure if he would shut her out again. He stopped beside her car. The hush between them felt fragile, like glass that could shatter with the slightest pressure. They glanced at each other, the orange glow of a street lamp illuminating James's tired eyes and the furrow in his brow. Emily worked up the nerve. "If this really is our last night, I don't want it to end like this. I feel like there's so much you're not telling me." His throat bobbed in a tense swallow. For a moment, she thought he might open up, but instead he inhaled shakily, words failing him. He glanced around as if searching for an exit, any reprieve from the weight of her questions. Then, in a gesture that surprised her, he reached out and clasped her hand. His grip was firm, almost desperate, and it sent a spark of concern through her. She squeezed back, sensing the depth of whatever he was holding inside. For a second, they stood locked in that moment. 2 people who had once been everything to each other, now hanging by a thread. Just as quickly, he let go, stepping back as though someone had nudged him away. His face twisted with something like regret or fear. She couldn't tell which. Without another word, he turned and headed toward his car, leaving Emily with a dull ache in her chest and even more questions swirling in her mind. Just before they part, James grips Emily's hand as if needing support, then abruptly lets go, leaving her with more questions than answers. Emily hovered by her car in the cool evening air, shaken by the strange combination of longing and uncertainty James had left behind. Her hand still tingled where he had briefly held it, as if part of him remained with her. When she looked up, he was already walking away, the sharp angles of streetlights tracing his stiff posture. She hesitated, wondering if she should call after him, but her voice caught in her throat. The only sound she could make was a soft sigh as she watched him disappear into the growing darkness. Not long after, her phone buzzed with a brief text. "If you still want that final night, come over." Below, he'd sent the address of the apartment they once shared, still technically James's place after she had moved out. Despite all the tension, something compelled her to accept. She climbed into her car and drove across town, her pulse dancing between anticipation and dread. The building loomed before her with a quiet familiarity that unsettled her. Every crack in the sidewalk, every stone of the exterior, reminded her of the early days when they'd first moved in as an eager, starry-eyed couple. She let herself into the lobby, nodding at a neighbor who recognized her with mild surprise and took the elevator to the floor she used to call home. James was waiting, the door already ajar. He offered a small nod in greeting, stepping aside so she could slip past him. Their gazes met in a moment that seemed to hold 100 questions. The inside of the apartment felt both alien and achingly familiar. The same furniture in slightly different positions, a few extra scuffs on the walls, the faint aroma of James's cologne mingling with the air. He closed the door softly. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. She nodded, noticing how his shoulders sagged with what might have been relief or resignation. She shrugged off her coat and draped it over the arm of the couch, her eyes scanning the living room. In her absence, it looked as though it had lost some spark. The walls seemed duller, the photographs askew on the mantel. She wondered if he had stopped bothering to maintain the warmth of the place once she left. Awkwardness settled in as they faced each other. At last, Emily gestured toward the kitchen, where she saw an empty mug next to a kettle on the countertop. "Maybe I'll make some tea," she offered, taking small steps in that direction, remembering exactly which cabinet still held the tea bags. James followed, leaning against the fridge as she busied herself with water and mugs. "We can sit and talk," he suggested. I guess we should talk, right?" "Yeah," she replied, fumbling with the kettle. She felt more nerves than she'd expected, the weight of all that was unsaid pressing down on her shoulders. "It's the last night, after all." Her voice carried a faint sadness that neither of them could deny. When the kettle began to whistle, James reached to turn off the heat. The simple, coordinated motion, her pouring hot water into the mugs while he steadied the kettle, suddenly reminded them of an earlier time when sharing tasks had been second nature. They retreated to the living room with steaming cups, the hush between them broken only by the quiet hiss of traffic from outside. Emily sat on the couch, and James settled in an armchair across from her. She wrapped her fingers around her mug, trying to steady the trembling that rose from somewhere deep inside. Her eyes drifted around the room, finally landing on a small wooden chest sitting under the coffee table, a place they used to store sentimental items and miscellaneous keepsakes. "Still have that old box?" she asked, nodding toward it. James followed her gaze, exhaling with a mirthless chuckle. "Yeah, haven't touched it much. Didn't feel right." An uncomfortable silence stretched, punctuated by the gentle clink of ceramic as Emily set her mug down. She leaned over, pulled the box out, and opened it. Inside lay a jumble of photos, ticket stubs, receipts from memorable dinners, even a dried flower or two. She picked up a faded photo from a holiday, both of them grinning like fools, covered in confetti. "We looked so happy," she murmured, rubbing her thumb over the curled edge. "It's like I'm seeing different people." James stared at the picture, swallowing hard. "We were different people, I guess," he said. "Or we changed more than we realized." A flicker of sadness flashed in Emily's eyes. "I keep wondering at what point it all started to go wrong." Without looking directly at her, he muttered, "Maybe the day we stopped sharing the important stuff." He shifted uneasily, pressing his palm to his temple. It seemed like the mention of deeper truths tapped into something physically painful. Emily noticed again how tense he appeared whenever she inched toward real questions. She pulled out another photo, the memory behind it too bittersweet to hold for long. Her chest felt tight, sorrow mixing with warmth. "We used to say we'd face anything together," she whispered, carefully putting it aside. "But we're not even facing ourselves anymore." James gave a curt nod, then reached up to rub his forehead. As if on cue, his phone began to ring from somewhere in the apartment. He flinched, rising from the armchair and practically racing into the kitchen to silence it. The abruptness of his movement startled Emily. She stood too, following slowly. In the kitchen, James had the phone to his ear, voice hushed. She could hear murmurs of a clinical tone on the other end, someone confirming a next appointment using words like results and important. Emily's heart lurched at the familiarity of the phrase. When he hung up, he turned to see her standing there. The tension in his features deepened. "It's nothing, Em," he insisted before she could speak. She lifted her hands in a helpless gesture. "You keep saying that. It doesn't feel like nothing." He moved past her, heading back into the living room. She followed close behind, confusion and frustration swirling in her. Just as she was about to press him further, her gaze landed on a small notepad lying on the coffee table. Scribbled across the top was the name of a medical center, half covered by a coffee mug. Her brow furrowed as she read it. He noticed her pause, eyes darting to the notepad. "Emily, don't," he started, but he didn't finish the sentence. Her heart pounded. "Why are you going to a medical center so often? What kind of test results are you getting?" James exhaled through clenched teeth. "I can't. Not tonight." His tone was pleading, an odd blend of despair and defensiveness. "I just can't go into it right now." She pressed her lips together, torn between pushing him and respecting his boundary. Finally, she nodded shakily. "Fine. But we can't keep circling around this. If tonight is really our last chance to talk, then please don't shut me out completely." His expression shifted, guilt etched into every line. He sank back onto the armchair, resting his head in his hands. A stifling heaviness filled the air, as if the entire room were bracing for something neither of them knew how to handle. To break the tension, Emily muttered something about checking the fridge for groceries. She discovered a few remnants from the week, a carton of eggs, half a loaf of bread, some vegetables on the brink of going bad. She began cooking a simple meal, not because she was hungry, but because it gave her something to do besides wrestle with the questions swirling in her head. As water boiled on the stove for pasta, James joined her, wordlessly chopping a tomato. They worked side by side, the small shared chore giving them a temporary truce. The soft glow of the kitchen light cast both their shadows on the wall, silhouettes close but not quite touching. Bit by bit, the tension receded into a fragile calm. When they finally sat down to eat, it was at the small table that once hosted so many lively breakfasts and late-night snacks. Now, the silence felt almost tangible, broken only by forks scraping plates. Both of them ate slowly, lost in separate thoughts. Mid-meal, Emily set down her fork. "We don't have to decide anything tonight," she whispered, "but I'm not ready to walk away from you if there's something else going on that I don't know about." James met her eyes, a flicker of sorrow there. "I just don't want to hurt you anymore," he said, voice unsteady. "I know I've messed up, but believe me, I'm trying to protect you." She frowned. "From what?" But he looked away, lips pressed tight, as if the words wouldn't come. The conversation hit a wall. By the time they finished eating and cleared the plates, the sky outside had grown dark, and the hush of late evening enveloped them. Emily suggested they head to bed, an odd suggestion, considering she'd stormed out of this apartment not so long ago. Yet she couldn't bear to leave, not while so many questions lingered. James nodded, leading her to the bedroom. They said goodnight with a gentle distance, as though acknowledging the walls that still remained between them. His footsteps disappeared down the hall to the living room, and Emily was left alone amid the shadows of what used to be their sanctuary. She slipped into the bathroom to wash her face and brush her teeth. That was when a small glint in the trash can caught her attention. At first, she wasn't sure what it was, but curiosity made her kneel down to look closer. A pill bottle lay partly buried under crumpled tissue. She pulled it out, her pulse racing when she saw James's name on the label. The prescription was for severe headaches, with a dosage that seemed higher than a standard migraine medication. Her mind spun. No wonder he kept cradling his head in pain. But was it just headaches, or something else? Hand trembling, she stepped out into the hall, the bottle clutched between her fingers. All her suspicions flared bright and urgent. The phone calls, the notepad mentioning a medical center, the way he recoiled whenever she asked about it. It was more than just routine stress or migraines. It had to be. Emily's hand trembles as she picks up the pills, certain that James has been lying about more than just his emotions. Emily stood in the hallway, clutching the prescription bottle with trembling fingers. Her pulse pounded like a warning drum, every beat urging her to face James once and for all. The label on the container, with its high dosage for chronic severe pain, told her that whatever he'd been hiding wasn't a simple headache. She took one careful breath, then stepped into the living room where he sat, the distant glow of a lamp casting heavy shadows across his face. When he heard her footsteps, James turned. His eyes fell immediately to the bottle in her hand, and a veil of defensiveness slid over his features. "Emily," he began, his voice low. He stood as if preparing for an argument. She held the bottle up, though her hand was still unsteady. "I found this," she said, trying to keep her voice level. "Do you want to tell me why your prescription is so strong? For how long you've been taking it?" His jaw tightened. "It's nothing you need to worry about." Her temper flared. "I'll decide that for myself," she shot back. "You've been acting strange for months, taking mysterious calls, shoving me away every time I ask if you're all right. I know this isn't normal, James." He sighed, scrubbing a hand through his hair. "Look, I'm dealing with a medical issue, but it's under control. I'm seeing doctors. That's it." Something about his tone, an odd mix of desperation and frustration, both angered and worried her. She marched closer, pressing the bottle into his chest. "Under control?" she repeated, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "Because it doesn't look like it's under control when you can barely hide your pain. You don't even bother telling me what's happening, and yet you keep saying you want a divorce." He pushed the pill bottle aside, voice rising. "This has nothing to do with the divorce." She could feel her cheeks burning. "Don't lie to me. You think I'm stupid? If you're not well, maybe you believe staying married is some extra burden you don't want me to deal with. Or maybe you're just trying to run away from everything because you're scared. Which is it?" A tense hush settled, and for a moment, James looked like he might explode in anger. Instead, he let out a long, ragged breath. He pressed his fingers to his temple as though a sharp pain had just speared through him. "Emily," he said eventually, almost in a whisper, I'm sick. And yes, I told you I wanted this divorce because I thought it'd be easier if you didn't have to see me like this." "Easier for who?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "Because I've felt nothing but confusion, pain, and heartbreak for the past few months. I thought we were just fighting, that we were too distant to fix things. Now you're telling me you're ill and still pushing me away?" He turned from her, running a hand over his face. "I'm not telling you anything. I never wanted you to find out," he muttered, regret saturating every syllable. "This," he gestured vaguely to the pill bottle, "it's for severe pain, migraines mostly, but it's more complicated than that." Emily edged forward, anger giving way to concern. "Then tell me how complicated. If you want me to understand, you have to give me something. For God's sake, James, we used to share everything." He closed his eyes for a moment as though summoning courage. "It's a neurological issue," he said softly. "Nothing's been confirmed 100% yet, but it could be something bigger. I didn't want to drag you into it until I knew for sure." Her heart clenched. A swirl of emotions, fear, relief, anger, washed over her in rapid succession. It wasn't the full story, but it was more than he'd given her in weeks. "Why would you keep that secret?" she whispered. I thought even if we fell out, I deserved to know you were suffering." He sank down onto the edge of the couch, shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'm sorry," he murmured, the words laced with sorrow. "I was selfish. I thought pushing you away was the right thing. I didn't want you to be worried or tied down or forced to watch me go through some painful process." She swallowed, recalling how they used to fight about smaller matters, bickering over chores, finances, the usual strains of married life. But this was the real wedge, the overshadowing fear he carried. Softening, she placed the pill bottle on the coffee table and sat down beside him. "I wouldn't have abandoned you," she said, voice breaking. "You should have known that." James nodded slowly, as though absorbing the gravity of his own mistakes. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence grew heavy until Emily felt she might suffocate from it. She reached for his hand, brushing it gently, recalling a time when even a small gesture was enough to reassure him. "I'm still your wife," she said. "Even if we were on the brink of divorce, I'm still the person who promised to be there for you. You know that, right?" He squeezed her hand in return, offering a weak, grateful smile before wincing again at some internal discomfort. "Thank you," he managed. "I'm sorry if it's too little, too late." Emily shook her head, blinking back tears. "We'll figure it out," she murmured, not quite sure if she believed it, but wanting to ease the ache in both of them. They stayed like that for a moment, close but guarded, the unspoken truth hovering between them. Eventually, a ring shattered the moment, echoing from James's phone. The screen lit up with Dr. Morales's name. Emily caught it over his shoulder and stiffened. He withdrew his hand from hers and stood to answer the call, his voice hoarse. "Hey, Doc," he greeted, turning away slightly. He murmured assurances that he was fine, insisted he'd be there for the next appointment, and hung up swiftly. Emily stared up at him, her chest tight. "Dr. Morales," she repeated, more statement than question. "So there really is more to this than migraines, isn't there?" James let out a slow breath, not meeting her eyes. "I'm not ready to talk details," he admitted. "Not yet." She set her jaw. "Tomorrow, then. You're taking me with you to whatever appointment that was. I'm done being in the dark." He glanced at her with a hint of guilt, then dipped his head in agreement. "All right," he said softly. "If you really want to come, I won't stop you." Before either could say more, Emily's phone buzzed on the side table. A message lit up the screen, the name of her mother at the top. The text glared with urgent words. "Don't sign anything yet. Think about it carefully." Emily's throat constricted, recalling that tomorrow was supposed to be the day she and James returned to the lawyer's office, the day the divorce would become official. She looked at James, her emotions churning. He'd just confessed to hiding a serious health problem, and yet the documents for their separation were still waiting. The weight of those contradictory realities pressed on her, making it hard to speak. She took a shaky breath, turned off the phone, and set it aside without responding. "Emily," James said quietly, noticing her distress. "It's late. We can figure out everything tomorrow. After I see the doctor, maybe I can explain it better." She nodded, though uncertainty coiled in her stomach. "I'm exhausted," she admitted. "It's been a long day." In the thick hush that followed, they both realized how tired they were, physically and mentally. The knowledge of his secret illness, the confusion about their marriage, it all felt like an enormous weight bearing down on them. Without another word, Emily stood and made her way toward the hallway that led to the guest room. James followed a few steps behind until she stopped at the door. They looked at each other under the dim corridor light. Shadows curved along James's cheekbones, emphasizing the fatigue in his expression. She reached up, brushed a thumb over one of the lines on his forehead, then pulled her hand away. "I'll stay in here tonight," she said softly. "I'm not leaving. Not yet." Something like relief crossed his face. He nodded, a whisper of a sad smile playing at his lips. "Thank you," he said, almost inaudible. She turned the doorknob, stepping inside. Her heart thudded with an urgent need for answers, but for now she told herself she could wait. Tomorrow might bring clarity, or heartbreak. Emily closes the guest room door, her heart racing at the realization that tomorrow may shatter everything they thought they knew about each other. Emily awoke to a soft gray light filtering through the guest room curtains. She lay still for a moment, disoriented, her mind a haze of conflicting emotions. The events of the previous night came rushing back. The argument, the pills, James's partial confession. With a steadying breath, she eased herself upright and slipped out of bed. In the hush of morning, her resolve hardened. She was going to the clinic with James today, whether he liked it or not. She found him in the kitchen, hunched over the table, a cup of coffee steaming by his elbow. The dark circles under his eyes made him look more tired than ever. When he sensed her presence, he glanced up with a drawn expression. "Morning," she said gently. "How are you feeling?" He offered a small, tight-lipped smile. "I've been better." He tapped his fingers on the table as if restless, unable to meet her gaze. "Look, about this doctor's appointment, you don't have to come if you don't want to." Emily stepped closer, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. "I'm coming. I already told you. I can't stay in the dark any longer." He sighed, staring into his coffee. For a moment she thought he might argue again, but all he did was nod and say, "Fine," in a resigned tone. They left the apartment soon after, the crisp morning air biting at their cheeks as they walked to the car. The tension between them was thick, though not as confrontational as before. It felt more like shared apprehension now, both uncertain of what the doctor might say. In the car, Emily kept her eyes on the passing streets. She dared not break the silence with small talk, fearing it would only make things more awkward. James drove with both hands gripping the wheel, his jaw set. She caught him wincing once or twice, as if pain arced behind his eyes. When they finally reached the clinic, Emily's stomach twisted at the sight of the pale stone building. It was bustling, and they joined the flow of patients heading through the glass doors. Inside, the lobby smelled of antiseptic and nerves. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead while a large digital board flashed appointment numbers. Emily instinctively reached for James's arm, hesitating before making contact. He didn't pull away, but he didn't exactly welcome the touch either. They approached the reception desk. James gave his name, and the receptionist asked them to take a seat. As they stepped away, Emily overheard her confirming the appointment with Dr. Morales. A bead of anxiety formed in her chest. She'd only glimpsed Dr. Morales's name on James's phone the night before. He was the key to answers she still didn't fully have. They sat in silence on stiff chairs, the hush broken by occasional coughs and the shuffle of nurses. Emily studied James's tense posture. He looked like someone bracing for a punch. She placed a tentative hand on his knee, searching his eyes for any sign he might finally let her in. Before either of them could speak, a voice called, "James Collins?" They glanced up to see a nurse in light blue scrubs holding a clipboard. James stood quickly, shoulders tight. Emily followed him down a corridor that smelled faintly of rubbing alcohol. They passed a row of private consultation rooms. Just as Emily was about to ask if he was okay, a friendly voice called from behind, "James? Hey, long time no see." Turning, Emily and James saw one of James's old co-workers, a man with thick glasses and a kind smile, stepping out of a lab-coated staff area. "Brad, hey." James managed to sound polite, but Emily felt him stiffen beside her. "Didn't know you were coming in today," Brad said, then noticed Emily at James's side. "Oh, hi, you must be Emily. I remember seeing pictures of you two at the office Christmas party a few years back." Emily forced a smile. "Yes, that's me." Brad's eyes flicked to James, concern etched in his face. "I hope everything's okay," he said gently. "Any updates on—" He trailed off, seeming to realize he might be breaching privacy. James cleared his throat. "Still figuring things out. We've got an appointment now, so—" Brad nodded with sympathy. "Of course. Good luck, man. Take care, Emily." He offered a small wave before disappearing into another corridor. Emily felt her heart pound. So others did know something. She watched James's eyes dart away, clearly uncomfortable. She resisted the urge to corner him right there. At the end of the hallway, a sign read, Dr. Morales, Neurology. Emily swallowed, stepping into an office lined with medical diagrams. A tall, composed man, presumably Dr. Morales, stood when they entered. He wore a white coat and a thoughtful expression. "James?" Dr. Morales greeted, shaking his hand. Then, noticing Emily, he smiled politely. "You must be Mrs. Collins?" The formality made her stiffen. "Emily is fine," she said. The doctor gestured for them to sit. With a click of his mouse, he brought up James's file on a screen, scanning it with a practiced gaze. Tension filled the small room, amplified by the soft hum of computers. "We have the results of your scans and the additional tests," Dr. Morales began, folding his hands. "There are some concerning signs that suggest we need to move forward with further imaging. The headaches you're experiencing, the neurological symptoms. There's a possibility of a mass we need to monitor closely." Emily felt her chest tighten. A mass. She didn't need a medical degree to know what that could mean. She angled her gaze toward James, who stared at the floor, jaw clenched. He looked smaller in that moment, as if the walls were closing in on Emily awoke to a soft gray light filtering through the guest room curtains. She lay still for a moment, disoriented, her mind a haze of conflicting emotions. The events of the previous night came rushing back. The argument, the pills, James's partial confession. With a steadying breath, she eased herself upright and slipped out of bed. In the hush of morning, her resolve hardened. She was going to the clinic with James today, whether he liked it or not. She found him in the kitchen, hunched over the table, a cup of coffee steaming by his elbow. The dark circles under his eyes made him look more tired than ever. When he sensed her presence, he glanced up with a drawn expression. "Morning," she said gently. "How are you feeling?" He offered a small, tight-lipped smile. "I've been better." He tapped his fingers on the table as if restless, unable to meet her gaze. "Look, about this doctor's appointment, you don't have to come if you don't want to." Emily stepped closer, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. "I'm coming. I already told you. I can't stay in the dark any longer." He sighed, staring into his coffee. For a moment she thought he might argue again, but all he did was nod and say, "Fine," in a resigned tone. They left the apartment soon after, the crisp morning air biting at their cheeks as they walked to the car. The tension between them was thick, though not as confrontational as before. It felt more like shared apprehension now, both uncertain of what the doctor might say. In the car, Emily kept her eyes on the passing streets. She dared not break the silence with small talk, fearing it would only make things more awkward. James drove with both hands gripping the wheel, his jaw set. She caught him wincing once or twice, as if pain arced behind his eyes. When they finally reached the clinic, Emily's stomach twisted at the sight of the pale stone building. It was bustling, and they joined the flow of patients heading through the glass doors. Inside, the lobby smelled of antiseptic and nerves. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead while a large digital board flashed appointment numbers. Emily instinctively reached for James's arm, hesitating before making contact. He didn't pull away, but he didn't exactly welcome the touch either. They approached the reception desk. James gave his name, and the receptionist asked them to take a seat. As they stepped away, Emily overheard her confirming the appointment with Dr. Morales. A bead of anxiety formed in her chest. She'd only glimpsed Dr. Morales' name on James's phone the night before. He was the key to answers she still didn't fully have. They sat in silence on stiff chairs, the hush broken by occasional coughs and the shuffle of nurses. Emily studied James's tense posture. He looked like someone bracing for a punch. She placed a tentative hand on his knee, searching his eyes for any sign he might finally let her in. Before either of them could speak, a voice called, "James Collins?" They glanced up to see a nurse in light blue scrubs holding a clipboard. James stood quickly, shoulders tight. Emily followed him down a corridor that smelled faintly of rubbing alcohol. They passed a row of private consultation rooms. Just as Emily was about to ask if he was okay, a friendly voice called from behind, "James? Hey, long time no see." Turning, Emily and James saw one of James's old co-workers, a man with thick glasses and a kind smile, stepping out of a lab-coated staff area. "Brad, hey?" James managed to sound polite, but Emily felt him stiffen beside her. "Didn't know you were coming in today," Brad said, then noticed Emily at James's side. "Oh, hi. You must be Emily. I remember seeing pictures of you two at the office Christmas party a few years back." Emily forced a smile. "Yes, that's me." Brad's eyes flicked to James, concern etched in his face. "I hope everything's okay," he said gently. "Any updates on—" He trailed off, seeming to realize he might be breaching privacy. James cleared his throat. "Still figuring things out. We've got an appointment now, so—" Brad nodded with sympathy. "Of course. Good luck, man. Take care, Emily." He offered a small wave before disappearing into another corridor. Emily felt her heart pound. So others did know something. She watched James's eyes dart away, clearly uncomfortable. She resisted the urge to corner him right there. At the end of the hallway, a sign read, "Dr. Morales, Neurology." Emily swallowed, stepping into an office lined with medical diagrams. A tall, composed man, presumably Dr. Morales, stood when they entered. He wore a white coat and a thoughtful expression. "James," Dr. Morales greeted, shaking his hand. Then, noticing Emily, he smiled politely. "You must be Mrs. Collins?" The formality made her stiffen. "Emily is fine," she said. The doctor gestured for them to sit. With a click of his mouse, he brought up James's file on a screen, scanning it with a practiced gaze. Tension filled the small room, amplified by the soft hum of computers. "We have the results of your scans and the additional tests," Dr. Morales began, folding his hands. "There are some concerning signs that suggest we need to move forward with more advanced imaging. The headaches you're experiencing, the neurological symptoms, there's a possibility of a mass we need to monitor closely." Emily felt her chest tighten. A mass. She didn't need a medical degree to know what that could mean. She angled her gaze toward James, who stared at the floor, jaw clenched. He looked smaller in that moment, as if the walls were closing in on him. Dr. Morales's voice was gentle but direct. "We need you to come in for a more in-depth scan. The results will help us determine whether we're dealing with a tumor or something else. It's critical we don't delay." Silence settled like dust on the room. Emily's throat felt painfully dry. She saw James's shoulders tense, watched him nod without looking up. She reached out and took his hand, ignoring the flicker of hesitation she felt from him. "When can we do it?" she asked softly, though her heart hammered with fear. "We have an opening this afternoon," the doctor replied. "It would be best to proceed as soon as possible." James swallowed, finally lifting his gaze. "All right," he said. "Let's do it." The nurse who'd escorted them knocked gently at the door, offering a folder of paperwork that needed completing. Dr. Morales set an appointment time, explaining that James should head to another wing of the clinic for pre-scan preparations. Emily was amazed that the conversation moved so quickly, like clockwork, even though their lives felt as if they were unraveling. They stepped into the hallway again, the fluorescent lighting suddenly harsh. James let go of Emily's hand and pressed his palm to his temple, as though the mention of an immediate scan had triggered another wave of pain. She hovered by his side, uncertain how to help. "Are you okay?" she asked, voice wavering. He forced a nod. "I just need to gather my thoughts. I wasn't expecting to jump straight into another test." Emily bit her lip, wanting to console him but unsure if he'd accept her comfort. "Let's sit down for a moment." They found a couple of vacant chairs near a large window overlooking a small courtyard. Pale sunlight filtered through the glass, revealing a row of patients and visitors pacing outdoors. James sank into one of the chairs, resting his elbows on his knees. She placed a hand on his back. "I'm here," she said softly. "We'll figure out the rest." He nodded, staring at the scuffed tiles under his feet. "I know," he whispered. "I'm sorry I kept so much from you." Before Emily could respond, her phone vibrated in her pocket. She glanced down, seeing a message from her sister asking if everything was all right. Emily shut her eyes briefly, inhaling to stay calm. There were too many moving parts: her family's questions, the looming divorce, and now the possibility of a serious tumor. As the nurse returned to call them for the scan prep, they rose again, stepping back into the swirl of voices and beeping machines. Emily filled out forms while James answered a series of quick questions from the medical team. She felt an invisible clock ticking. Every moment heightened her resolve to stand by him, even if the path ahead was terrifying. After handing in the forms, they were told there'd be a short wait before James could go in. The two of them found an empty corner in the corridor leaning against the wall. He rubbed his face, looking exhausted. "We'll handle this," Emily repeated, more to convince herself than anything else. He closed his eyes. "I don't know how, but I appreciate it." Soon, a technician appeared, calling James's name again. They were led to a specialized imaging room full of advanced machinery. The sight of it all rattled Emily, but she kept her focus on James, noticing the tight set of his jaw as if he was steeling himself for whatever the scan might reveal. When a staff member asked Emily to remain in a waiting area, she hesitated, reluctant to let him go. But James gave her a small nod, stepping behind the door with the technician. The door shut with a solid click, leaving Emily alone with her swirling thoughts. The hum of the machines behind the walls was faint but insistent, a steady reminder of the seriousness of their situation. Minutes stretched into an hour, then longer. Emily paced the waiting area, restless and on edge. She messaged her sister to say she'd explain everything later, ignoring the texts from her mother about the divorce papers. It all felt inconsequential compared to the possibility that James might be gravely ill. At last, a nurse informed her that the scan was done. Emily's breath caught as James reappeared, pale under the fluorescent lights, hair slightly tousled from lying on the machine's table. She hurried to his side. He glanced at her with weary eyes. "They'll let us know soon," he said, voice rough. "We might have to come back tomorrow for the full results." She nodded, uncertain how to respond. Relief mingled with dread, relief that the test was over, dread at what the test might say. In a subdued silence, they headed toward the bank of elevators that would take them back to the lobby. Emily pressed the down button, heart pounding. The elevator doors slid open. Inside, a mirror reflected their fatigued faces, a poignant reminder of how worn they both were. As the doors closed, James stared at the floor, then suddenly looked up at her. "I'm sorry, Em," he said, voice trembling. "There's more you need to know." The elevator jolted to a stop, doors sliding apart before he could explain, leaving Emily breathless with anticipation. The moment the elevator doors slid open onto the busy lobby, James's words clung to the air. Emily stepped out first, turning back to him in confusion. He'd just said there was more she needed to know, finally acknowledging the deeper secret he'd been carrying. But with people pushing past them in the corridor, they had no chance to speak. She could feel his tension behind her, emanating in waves. They made it outside, stepping into a parking garage tinged with diesel fumes and echoing footsteps. As soon as the concrete pillars surrounded them, James stopped abruptly beside a parked car. "Em," he began quietly at first. His eyes flickered with fear, and his voice seemed to catch in his throat. "It's not just a possibility. They keep saying mass and tumor like it might be something small or benign, but I've known for a while it's most likely malignant." Emily's breath halted, heart hammering so loudly she could hear the rush in her ears. She recalled all the sideways glances, the hidden medication, the desperate phone calls, And now, hearing him speak the words malignant, all her anger and concern collided in an explosion of emotion. "You've known?" she repeated, voice quivering. "You've known for how long?" He dropped his gaze, pressing a hand to the car's hood as if for balance. "A couple of months," he admitted, each word a confession dragging him down. "I wanted more tests done, more opinions. I kept hoping the doctors would discover it was something else, something easier." Her throat constricted. "So this entire time I've been blaming us, blaming our fights, thinking we just drifted apart. But you were pushing me away because you're seriously ill?" His posture sagged. "I thought it'd be kinder to do it that way. I didn't want you to watch me deteriorate. It was wrong. I know that now." Raw anger bubbled up in her chest. "Do you have any idea how hard it's been? I was convinced we'd just fallen out of love, that I did something, or you did something. But all this time, you were fighting a battle alone." Her voice rose enough that a passerby turned to look, concern flickering on the stranger's face. Realizing they were about to turn their discussion into a public spectacle, Emily sucked in a breath and willed herself to lower her tone. James glanced around, eyes wild with guilt. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I never meant to hurt you like this." Emily swiped at a stray tear on her cheek. She wanted to scream at him for the months of secrecy, to demand how he could possibly leave her in the dark for so long. But she also saw the deep lines of exhaustion on his face, the weight of a man terrified not only for his life, but for how his illness could affect the person he loved. She walked a few steps away, pacing to gather her composure. The garage's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a stark glare. Each echo of footsteps seemed amplified, a reminder they weren't alone. But in that moment, they might as well have been in their own world, the gravity of a broken relationship colliding with the reality of a life-threatening condition. Finally, she turned back to him. Let's just get out of here," she murmured. "We can talk more at home." He nodded, swallowing. They climbed into his car, both too rattled to make small talk. He started the engine in silence, and the drive back was tense and quiet. Emily watched the city blur by through the passenger window, mind racing with questions. The word tumor reverberated in her head, dredging up images of hospital rooms, invasive treatments, and uncertain outcomes. When they arrived at the apartment, Emily led the way up the stairs, fury still simmering beneath her concern. Inside, she found their living room unchanged from the hectic morning, coffee cups on the table, a lingering sense of dread. She turned, fixing James with a stare that was equal parts hurt and urgency. "I need to know everything," she said, crossing her arms. "All of it. No more half-answers." He stood by the couch, running a hand through his hair. "What the doctors suspect is a brain tumor in a spot that might be operable, but it's risky. They say I might need chemo, radiation, the whole deal, assuming the surgery goes well and they can remove enough of it." His eyes flickered with despair. "I haven't wanted to accept it, let alone share it." Emily felt her chest tighten. "Why was pushing me away the answer? Were you planning to just sign the divorce papers and disappear?" The question hung in the air, raw and bitter. James slumped onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. "I thought it would be easier for you, for both of us," he whispered. "I know it sounds ridiculous. I was in denial, maybe, or I was trying to protect you from the worst. I didn't think I could handle seeing you watch me go through something so ugly." She approached, kneeling in front of him. Tentatively, she laid a hand on his knee, her voice trembling. "We made vows. Sickness and health, remember?" He lifted his head, eyes red-rimmed. "Yeah, but I thought that by letting you go, you wouldn't be forced to live out that vow in the worst possible way." Her anger softened into heartbreak. "James, that's not how any of this works. I love you. Even if we've been fighting, even if we said we're ending things. That love doesn't just vanish the moment you get sick. He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I'm sorry," he repeated, voice trembling with emotion. "I never wanted to hurt you like this. I was being a coward." Just then, a phone buzzed on the coffee table, snapping them out of the moment. Emily recognized the lawyer's number on the screen, and an odd wave of conflict rolled through her. It served as a stark reminder that, legally, they were still on the brink of a final decision. The documents waited for them, a black-and-white decree that everything between them was finished. Wordlessly, she reached over and tapped the screen to silence it. She glanced at James, who gave a hollow nod. "The divorce," he murmured, as if the thought alone was too heavy to bear. She rose to her feet, taking a slow breath. "Let's worry about the divorce later," she said, her tone firm. "It's not our priority right now." He glanced away, tears threatening. "I get it if you still want out," he whispered. "I wouldn't blame you." Her heart ached, recalling the doubts and anger she'd harbored for so long. But she shook her head. "I'm not signing anything right now," she said simply. "We need to figure out how we're going to face this." His expression wavered between relief and guilt. "I still feel like I don't deserve your help," he admitted. Emily bit her lip, remembering the painful months of confusion he put her through. Yet seeing the brokenness in his eyes, she realized how fear could twist even the best intentions. "This isn't about deserving," she said quietly. "It's about what we mean to each other." For a moment, the tension in the room eased. They stood a foot apart, uncertain but united in a new resolve. She placed a tentative hand on his cheek, and he let out a shaky breath, leaning into her touch. They decided to order dinner, nothing fancy, just takeout from the little place around the corner that used to be their guilty pleasure. While they waited for the delivery, Emily moved around the kitchen, tidying things, giving herself time to process. James watched her from the living room, an odd mix of shame and yearning on his face. When the food arrived, they ate quietly at the small table, acknowledging how surreal it felt. They had parted ways, nearly divorced, and now they were back under the same roof discussing tumor scans and potential surgeries. Emily tried to lighten the mood with a memory of one of their first dates, but the laughter caught in her throat, overshadowed by the reality of their situation. As they finished, James set down his fork and exhaled a tremulous sigh. Emily mirrored him, looking at her half-eaten meal. Her emotions were still knotted inside, not fully resolved, but she felt something shift between them, an unspoken understanding that their battles were bigger than the arguments that had once seemed insurmountable. She closed the takeout box, then locked eyes with him. "We're going to fight this. Together." He closed his eyes, unsure whether to hope or despair. Emily awoke at dawn to an uneasy silence. The apartment seemed too still, as if waiting for something ominous to happen. She glanced at the other side of the bed. James had insisted she take their old room while he slept in the guest room. He wasn't there, and her heart lurched. Pulling on a sweater, she made her way into the hallway, guided by a faint light in the kitchen. She found him leaning over the counter, one hand pressed firmly to his temple. At first, he didn't notice her. His breath was quick and shallow, and she could see perspiration at his hairline. Concern jolted her fully awake. "James?" she said softly, stepping closer. He lifted his head with obvious effort, eyes bloodshot from pain or lack of sleep, or both. "Sorry if I woke you," he mumbled. I couldn't sleep. My head." She didn't need more explanation. The tension etched into his features spoke volumes. She reached for her phone. "We're going to the hospital," she said, determined not to let him object this time. He tried to protest. "It might pass. Just need some meds." But his voice cut off in a gasp of pain. The sight of him gripping the edge of the counter for support stung Emily's heart. She grabbed her keys and guided him gently toward the door, dialing for an ambulance as they moved. By the time they reached the lobby, James was trembling, his jaw clenched to keep from crying out. The ride to the emergency room was a blur. Red and blue lights flickered across Emily's vision as a paramedic took James's vital signs. The noise of the siren merged with her pounding pulse, and all she could do was hold onto his hand, whispering words of reassurance that felt painfully inadequate. It struck her how quickly the situation had escalated. Just a short while ago, they'd been tentatively discussing their future, or lack of it, and now she was fighting back tears in an ambulance, desperate to keep him conscious. When they reached the ER, a rush of nurses and a gurney swept James through double doors, leaving Emily in a waiting area that smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. A wave of frustration engulfed her. She wanted to run after him, to make sure he wasn't alone, but hospital protocol forced her to wait. She felt her legs buckle slightly as she found a plastic chair, phone clutched in a shaking hand. Within an hour, James's parents arrived, alerted by a concerned nurse who'd rummaged through his records for an emergency contact. They appeared breathless and worried, slowing only when they caught sight of Emily pacing in the corridor. His mother's eyes flashed with a mixture of anxiety and blame. "What happened?" she demanded. "We heard he had a horrible episode. Why wasn't this addressed sooner?" Emily swallowed. She'd been steeling herself for a confrontation like this, but it still hit hard. "He'd been feeling worse," she explained, voice shaky. "We were about to see if we could schedule more tests, but it all happened so fast." His father, usually stoic, paced with hands clenched behind his back. "The last we heard, you were both calling it quits. Now suddenly you're back and he's in the hospital again?" Something defensive sparked inside Emily, but she tried to keep calm. "Yes, we were close to finalizing the divorce. But once I found out about his condition, I couldn't just leave him alone." His mother pressed her lips into a thin line. "He didn't want you to be burdened. He told us that's why he pushed you away. Yet here you are, in the thick of it." Emily felt her cheeks grow hot. "I'm here because he needs me," she said quietly, "and because I need to be here." Before either parent could respond, a nurse summoned them back into a narrow hallway leading to a private room. Inside, James lay pale and exhausted on a hospital bed, an IV snaking from his arm. Machines beeped softly. Emily's heart twisted at the sight of him looking so fragile. His sister entered moments later, eyes wide with alarm. She exchanged a look with Emily that hovered between wariness and relief. "Thank God you got him here," she said to Emily in a low voice, acknowledging the urgency. Then she turned to James, stroking his hair back from his forehead. "Is it the tumor?" she whispered, her question raw in the quiet room. Before anyone could answer, a doctor entered, a tall woman with determined eyes and a stethoscope looped around her neck. She introduced herself and flicked through James's file. After a brief assessment, she frowned. "The pressure in his head is increasing. We'll need to look at updated scans to see if there's any new swelling or if the tumor has grown. I'm also concerned about the risk of seizures." She spoke briskly, scanning the monitors. James closed his eyes, clearly in too much discomfort to speak. Emily, standing near the foot of the bed, felt a wave of panic. The urgency of the doctor's words made the threat they faced painfully real. His parents stood by helplessly, exchanging anxious glances. James's mother finally turned to Emily, her voice trembling. "Do you have any idea how we're supposed to cover all these treatments if things get more complicated?" Emily felt her stomach clench. She knew finances had always weighed on James's mind, especially with something as serious as neurosurgery or radiation therapy. "We'll figure it out," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "If it means taking loans or—" The mother's eyes flashed with frustration. "We can't rely on just loans. It's going to cost a fortune if this becomes long-term, and with everything so uncertain—" James's sister spoke up, voice unsteady. "I can help, Mom. Whatever it takes." Tension crackled in the small room. Emily sensed it wasn't merely about money, it was also about trust, about what role each person was going to play. She forced herself to keep her gaze steady. refusing to back down. "We'll talk to the doctors," she said firmly. "We'll get a plan, no matter what it costs." A knock at the door signaled the arrival of a specialist, the same Dr. Morales who had performed some of James's earlier assessments. His grave expression offered little comfort as he began to explain possible surgical interventions, the scope of radiation or chemotherapy, and the importance of acting quickly. Each sentence hammered home how precarious James's condition was. While the family listened, Emily noticed James trying to stay awake. His eyelids flickered, beads of sweat forming on his brow. She moved closer, gently taking his hand in hers. He squeezed back weakly, a silent plea for strength. She had no illusions about the road ahead. It was going to be difficult, heartbreaking, and costly. But as she looked at the face of the man she loved, she knew she wasn't going anywhere. Dr. Morales wrapped up his initial briefing with a weary sigh. "We'll wait for the results of these new scans. If the tumor's size has shifted or if the pressure is too high, we might need immediate intervention. Until then, keep him comfortable. Don't let him strain himself." James's father quietly asked for details about possible payment plans, a question Dr. Morales handled with professional compassion. Emily noticed how small and frightened James's mother suddenly looked, her stern demeanor giving way to raw fear. The mention of cost only deepened everyone's worry. James's sister hovered close, rubbing her mother's back in a gesture of reassurance. Emily stayed by James's side, wiping the perspiration from his forehead with a cool cloth. His breathing steadied, though he still looked half lost in pain. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, and she realized it was the lawyer's number again. She let it go to voicemail. The divorce was the last thing on her mind. Hours bled into the afternoon, the hush of the room broken by the beep of machines and the occasional shuffle of nurses checking vitals. Emily's stomach churned with anxiety, but she tried to keep her tone soothing whenever she whispered encouragement in James's ear. At one point, she slipped out to grab water from a vending machine. Upon returning, she found James's parents in a muted discussion about their old resentments toward Emily, fears that she'd walk away or that her presence might only confuse him. But as soon as they saw her, they fell silent. She held her head high, deciding that no matter what they thought, she wasn't leaving. Late that night, after more tests and consultations, the family tension finally eased a little. They all recognized that James's condition took precedence over any differences they had. Emily stepped out into the hall to check with the nurse's station about the next steps. She noticed the exhaustion in her own reflection in a glass panel, hair disheveled, eyes rimmed with shadows. A nurse mentioned that it could be a day or two before the full scan results came back. With the immediate crisis stabilizing, James's parents decided to head home to rest, promising to return in the morning. His sister departed as well, though she gave Emily a quick squeeze on the shoulder first, an unspoken gesture of solidarity. Alone by the corridor window, Emily sank into a chair, flipping open her laptop to respond to urgent emails and check any medical research she could find. She felt worn to the bone, every part of her weighed down by fear. The screen cast a pale glow over her face as she typed, searching for stories of survival, reading about advanced treatments, grasping at any glimmer of hope. Just as she was about to close the laptop, her phone buzzed again. The hospital's main number flashed across the screen. She answered with a trembling hand. A calm voice on the line said, "Ms. Collins, this is Dr. Morales. We just received some preliminary images. I'm afraid we need to discuss them as soon as possible." Her breath caught in her throat. Did it spread?" He hesitated. "I want to meet in person, but yes. There are signs of progression in the scans." As Emily closes her laptop, she gets a call from the hospital. The latest scans show alarming signs that the tumor might have spread further, sending her heart plummeting. Emily pressed her phone to her ear, blood pounding so loudly in her ears that she could barely make out the doctor's words. The hallway lights flickered against the polished floor, and the hum of the hospital's overhead speakers faded to a distant drone. Dr. Morales's calm yet urgent tone conveyed the gravity of the situation. The scans showed signs that the tumor might have grown beyond what they had feared. She murmured a soft thanks before ending the call, her heart anchored by a heavy mixture of dread and determination. Late that night, she returned to James's hospital room, dread burning in her chest. The dull beep of machines and the soft tread of nurses filled the silence. A single lamp glowed near the corner, casting a pale circle over James's sleeping form. He looked impossibly fragile, his breathing shallow but steady. Emily slid into the chair beside his bed, resting her hand gently on his arm. Even in sleep, the lines of tension across his brow spoke of the battle raging inside him. By morning, her eyes ached from sleepless hours. At some point, she dozed off in the chair, only to jerk awake whenever a nurse came in to check James's vitals. As sunlight crept through the narrow window, she tried to gather the resolve needed for what she had to do next. With the doctor's warning echoing in her mind, she realized it was time to seek another opinion, another approach, something that gave James a fighting chance beyond the standard procedures this hospital could offer. When James finally stirred, blinking against the brightness in the room, Emily forced a reassuring smile. He looked around, disoriented, then recognized her with a faint nod. "You stayed," he murmured, voice raw. "Of course," she whispered, trying to quell the wave of relief that he was awake. "How are you feeling?" He pressed his lips together. "Like I'm walking a tightrope," he admitted, eyes flicking to the IV line and the bag of medication dripped into his veins. "I remember bits of last night, the pain, everyone hovering." He took a shallow breath. "They said the tumor might be spreading?" It sounded as if he was hoping she'd deny it, claim it was all a nightmare. Emily squeezed his hand. "Dr. Morales wants more scans, but it doesn't look good. I'm so sorry." She leaned forward, voice trembling. "That's why I was thinking. We should look for a second opinion, see if there's any experimental therapy out there, something they might be researching in another facility." His brows knitted together, a flash of fear mixing with curiosity. "You really think that'll help?" She nodded, swallowing. "I can't just sit here and wait for bad news to confirm itself. We need a bigger arsenal, something that might give us more than the standard route." A light knock on the door interrupted them. One of James's nurses entered, carrying a tray of breakfast and some medication cups. She set them down quietly, offering a sympathetic nod as she adjusted the angle of the bed. "Doctor should be in soon to talk next steps," the nurse said. "Take your time." With that, she left, and the hush returned. James stared at the tray, eyes distant. "Emily, what about the finances? We can't just run off to a big research hospital without knowing how we'll pay for it." She steadied herself with a soft inhale. "We'll figure something out. Insurance will cover part, and maybe we can look at specialized grants or clinical trials. If we have to sell things, we will. The important thing is finding an option that gives you a fighting chance." He exhaled shakily. "I'm scared," he admitted. "But maybe it's worth trying." The vulnerability in his voice reminded her how thin his shell of strength had become. Soon, Dr. Morales stepped in. He had the same composed demeanor as always, but when he spoke, Emily detected an undertone of concern. "I've arranged for an additional scan this afternoon, but I also support the idea of getting a second opinion if that's what you want," he said, turning his gaze from one to the other. "There's a cutting-edge facility upstate that's been conducting trials for aggressive tumors. It's not guaranteed, but they've had some promising results." Emily leaned forward, hope fluttering in her chest. "What's it called?" He provided the name and a reference to a leading oncologist there. While it wasn't a cure-all, it represented a glimmer of possibility. James, though hesitant, listened intently. As they spoke, James's parents entered, drawn by the conversation. His mother looked drained, eyes puffy from tears. She nodded in recognition of Dr. Morales's words, even as anxiety etched deeper lines on her face. His father stood behind her, arms folded, face stern with worry. "Anything is better than sitting on our hands," James's father said gruffly, glancing at Emily. "We want him to have the best shot, no matter what." The tension between Emily and his parents, once so palpable, softened in the face of this shared crisis. Even James's sister, who arrived moments later, set aside any lingering doubts. The family, united by a common goal, formed a tight circle around James's bed, discussing the possibility of traveling for treatment, scouring options, and pooling resources. For the first time in a long while, they seemed to speak one language, hope laced with desperation. Emily volunteered to make calls to the research hospital, searching for open slots. Meanwhile, James's sister offered to set up an online fundraiser just in case finances became overwhelming. Though each face showed different shades of fear, the sense of action helped them all cling to a fragile optimism. They weren't beaten yet. By midday, Emily had secured a preliminary phone consultation. The specialist, a Dr. Hughes, requested James's medical records to review whether he qualified for one of their experimental drug regimens. It wasn't guaranteed, but at least they had a foot in the door. Even James admitted he felt a slight lift, a flicker in his eyes that might have been the return of confidence. He asked Emily to help him sit up straighter in bed, as if determined to greet this new path with what little strength he had. After so many hours in the hospital, the family agreed on a plan. Emily and James would gather his documents, consult with Dr. Hughes by phone, and if he was accepted into the trial, they'd prepare to travel within days. For once, the mention of the divorce papers didn't overshadow everything. They all understood that life had changed drastically, and the old plans felt unimportant in the shadow of a life-threatening illness. Late that afternoon, James managed to walk a few laps around the corridor with Emily by his side, an IV pole rattling along. He was unsteady, but the exercise seemed to clear his mind. They talked about the prospect of relocating to the research center for a while, maybe renting a small place near the hospital. Emily promised to handle logistics, reminding him again and again that he wasn't alone. Just as they returned to his room, Dr. Morales appeared with fresh news. The updated scans confirmed that the tumor had spread in a way that demanded urgent intervention, radiation, surgery, or both. Before despair could take hold, Emily reminded him they had an appointment with Dr. Hughes by phone the next morning. Dr. Morales offered encouragement, cautioning them to move quickly if that was the path they chose. Later, with the hospital winding down for the evening, the overhead lights dimmed in the corridors, and the bustle quieted to a distant hum. Emily sat on the edge of James's bed, massaging his hand gently. His lids were heavy with fatigue, yet some spark still glimmered in his gaze when he whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." She shook her head. That's never been an option. Leaning in, she pressed her lips to his forehead. For a moment, the world felt suspended in a hush of gratitude and fear. Outside, a passing nurse offered them a kind smile as if to say, "Don't lose hope just yet." Finally, near midnight, Emily stepped out to find coffee at a vending machine. She needed caffeine and a moment alone. The weight of decisions, scheduling, finances, what could happen if Dr. Hughes's trial didn't pan out, bore down on her. But she forced herself to stay strong, to hold on to the promise that there could be a miracle, even if it came with risks. In the early morning, James was stable enough to be released with strict instructions. His family gathered his belongings, carefully placing them in a couple of small bags. Emily helped him to the car, each step a gentle push toward whatever lay ahead. He slumped into the passenger seat, exhaling deeply, relieved and apprehensive all at once. They closed the car doors, exhaustion evident in both their faces, but neither ready to back down from the fight. Emily fished the keys from her purse just as the phone rang with an unfamiliar number. She exchanged a glance with James before answering, heart lodged in her throat. A confident voice introduced himself as Dr. Hughes. "I have James's files in front of me," he said, calm but brisk. "We need to talk about the specifics of your case. Something in these test results caught my attention." Emily swallowed, adrenaline surging. "We're listening." "Is there any chance you can come in today?" he asked. "I've just finished reviewing the new scans you sent, and time is critical. If you're committed to the trial, we need to move quickly." She glanced at James, who looked back with the same fierce determination. "Yes," she said, voice steady. "We'll leave right now." They thanked him, hung up, and Emily tightened her grip on the steering wheel. James closed his eyes for a brief second, mustering his waning energy. Both understood that the next hours could redefine everything they believed about hope and survival. Just as they settle into the car, Dr. Hughes calls to say a new set of test results has come in, and they need to return to the hospital immediately. Emily's knuckles went white against the steering wheel as she guided the car back onto the main road. Her pulse drummed in her ears, reverberating with the urgency of Dr. Hughes's call. James sat beside her, eyes half closed, bracing himself for whatever news awaited them. Though she kept her gaze on the traffic, Emily noticed how his breathing quickened every time they took a turn too sharply. In the back seat, the medical files rustled with each bump in the road, a stark reminder of the fragile state of his health. It felt surreal, rushing yet again to the hospital, just when they had begun to imagine a plan that might give them more time. Emily reminded herself that Dr. Hughes had sounded direct but not entirely grim, mentioning something about a therapy that might show promise. She clung to that small thread of optimism, her heart pleading for any sign of good news after so much fear. They arrived at the hospital, parking haphazardly in a visitor's spot near the emergency entrance. Emily helped James out of the car, her arm looped around his waist for support. He leaned on her, more exhausted than usual, though he tried to hide it behind a thin smile. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered off freshly polished floors, and the echo of hurried footsteps reminded them that time moved differently within these walls. Dr. Hughes was waiting near the reception desk, his lab coat crisp, a folder in hand. Tall and composed, he ushered them into a private consultation room without preamble. The quiet there was broken only by the soft hum of the overhead lamp. As James settled into a chair, Emily dropped her purse on the floor and perched anxiously beside him. "I'm sorry to call you back so abruptly," Dr. Hughes began, his voice steady. "We've analyzed the new images. The tumor is still aggressive, but there are indications a targeted therapy may slow its spread." James exhaled a trembling breath. "So, there's hope?" His words came out in a hush. "There's definitely hope," Dr. Hughes replied. "However, we don't have the luxury of time. We need to begin immediately if you're willing. You'll have to stay here under close observation for a while." Emily pressed her hand over James's. She felt tension ripple through him, relief mingled with anxiety. "What exactly does the therapy involve?" she asked. Dr. Hughes explained the regimen, specialized medication designed to attack certain cancerous cells, combined with possible radiation sessions. He spoke calmly of harsh side effects, the importance of strict schedules, and the unpredictability of how each patient might respond. Emily's stomach knotted at the mention of potential complications, but James nodded along, resolute. As the doctor left to arrange a room, they were both seized by a mixture of anticipation and dread. Emily gave James's hand a squeeze. "We're in this," she said, voice low and unwavering. He swallowed. "Yeah, all the way." Soon they found themselves in a small, private ward. Windows offered a glimpse of the courtyard below, and the subdued beep of monitors filtered in through half-closed doors. Nurses arrived with a flurry of paperwork and IV lines. Within the hour, James was hooked up to machines that dripped a pale liquid into his veins, the first dose of the experimental therapy. Exhaustion clouded his features, but beneath it lay a spark of determination. Emily stayed at his bedside, greeting James's parents and sister when they arrived. The family was fraught with questions: finances, success rates, the possible move to remain near this specialized care. But for now, those worries faded into the background, overshadowed by relief that at least something was being done. Emily could see that even James's mother, normally prickly toward her, was grateful someone stood watch at his side. "Thank you," the older woman murmured when Emily slipped into the hallway for a moment's respite. "I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, but you're here, and he needs that." Emily managed a brief smile, eyes moist. "I'm just doing what anyone would if they loved him." Back in James's room, side effects quickly made themselves known. He grew nauseous, groaning softly as he fought dizziness. Nurses brought cool cloths and tried to keep him hydrated. At one point, Emily pressed the damp cloth to his forehead and saw a flicker of desperation in his eyes. She whispered encouraging words, wishing there was more she could do to ease his pain. Hours blurred into late evening. The overhead lights dimmed, and the hospital quieted, though it never truly slept. Emily insisted on staying in a narrow recliner by James's bed. She dozed fitfully, waking whenever he stirred or a nurse came to adjust his drip. In the early morning, she gazed through half-shut lids at James's tired face, remembering the day they met in college, how he'd made her laugh with an offhand joke. Funny how everything else seemed trivial when measured against the present fight for life. By the second day of treatment, a faint improvement appeared in his vitals. Nothing miraculous, but enough to lighten the gloom. Dr. Hughes noted that certain markers hinted the therapy might be taking hold, though it was far too early to celebrate. Still, that tiny uptick was enough for Emily's heart to swell with renewed faith. James's sister visited with an armful of homemade soup containers, hoping to tempt his appetite. He managed a spoonful or two, smiling faintly at her fussing. His parents hovered, occasionally stepping out to the corridor to discuss finances and ways to cope with the mounting bills. Meanwhile, Emily tried not to think about the divorce papers. Every time the thought arose, memories of that quiet office with crisp documents awaiting signatures, she shook it away. Late that afternoon, James dozed off, lulled by medication. Emily slipped out into the hallway, massaging the knots in her neck. Her phone buzzed, a friend checking in, another message from her mother about the tangled state of her personal life. She responded with a simple, "He's in treatment, uncertain but hopeful," then stowed the phone away. Dwelling on the past or future felt overwhelming. All that mattered was the present moment, the beep of his monitor, and the possibility that the therapy might work. That evening, Dr. Hughes appeared at the door. He motioned for Emily to step out. Her stomach clenched at his serious expression. "I wanted to let you know, some of James's vitals look slightly better," he said. "There's a glimmer here, but I also need you to prepare yourselves. The therapy is intense and we don't know how he'll handle the next phase. His body might react unpredictably." Emily nodded, bracing against the wave of relief that threatened to crash into fresh worry. "We'll take it one day at a time." When she returned to the room, James was awake, blinking groggily. She sat beside him and tried to frame Dr. Hughes's words in the most encouraging light possible. He swallowed thickly, thanking her for always telling him the truth, no matter how hard. He confessed he felt moments of sheer terror between waves of pain, and that hearing her voice grounded him. Night settled in again, the hush of the hospital broken only by distant footsteps. Emily held James's hand, noticing how his fingers felt warmer than they had the previous day, perhaps another tiny sign that the meds were circulating well. They spoke in whispers, recalling favorite vacations and silly moments from early in their marriage. For those few hours, the fear receded, replaced by quiet reminiscence that linked them heart to heart. When a nurse came by to dim the lights, Emily caught James's eyes drifting shut. She brushed his hair back gently, pressing a kiss to his temple. Tomorrow would bring more tests and more unknowns, but for now, she let herself believe that hope had a fighting chance against despair. Well, after midnight in the half-lit corridor, she typed a short message to James's family group chat. Slight improvement in vitals, still stable. Keep praying. She slid the phone back into her pocket, feeling something close to gratitude that at least tonight there was no emergency call dragging them into another crisis. Then, almost on cue, a shadow fell across the doorway. She turned to see Dr. Hughes standing there, a folder tucked under his arm and a grave look on his face. She felt her pulse spike immediately. He gestured for her to step away from the bed, wanting to speak without waking James. The folder in his hand looked thick, filled with fresh data. "We need to talk about the next steps," he said quietly, his tone hinting at a new hurdle that could change everything. Dr. Hughes stood by the half-open door, the hospital's hallway lights casting long shadows behind him. The gravity in his eyes confirmed what Emily already suspected. A critical decision lay ahead. She stepped out of James's room, quietly shutting the door so he could rest, then followed the doctor to a small consultation area at the end of the corridor. In the background, the subdued hum of hospital life continued. Rolling gurneys, muted voices, the steady beep of distant monitors. Dr. Hughes spread out the most recent test results on a small table. Emily's gaze swept over the crisp pages, thick with charts and technical terms she couldn't fully decipher. Still, seeing them arranged like this made the situation more tangible, like they were standing at a junction where any path taken could mean the difference between hope and heartbreak. He lowered his voice as though not wanting to shatter the hush around them. "The therapy is showing some promise," he began. "We see small improvements in James's blood work and certain markers. But there's another complication. New scans show that the tumor's core may be pressing against sensitive areas. If it grows even a fraction more, it could compromise critical functions." Emily steadied herself against a chair. "What can we do?" she asked, fighting the tremor in her voice. Dr. Hughes hesitated. "A more invasive surgery might help remove or reduce the mass. It's high risk. There's a possibility of damaging healthy tissue, and it's not a guarantee. But if successful, it could buy time for the targeted therapy to work better. In some cases, it's what makes the difference between remission and merely slowing the spread." She pressed her lips together. "Does James know yet?" "I wanted to discuss it with you first," the doctor replied gently. "He'll need support, and you'll need to make this decision together." Emily thanked him, shoulders tense with the weight of it all. The hallway felt colder somehow as she walked back to James's room. Through the small window in the door, she saw him lying still, eyes closed, though she knew he wasn't sleeping. His brow knit in concentration, as if bracing against pain. Slipping inside, she approached his bedside and he looked up with weary curiosity. "What did he say?" James asked, managing a semblance of calm. She sank into a chair, taking his hand in hers. "Surgery. A dangerous one, but it might give the therapy a better chance to beat this thing." His eyes flickered, showing both fear and a glint of determination. "And what do you think?" Emily exhaled a shaky breath. "I think we should try, if you're willing. I don't want you to go through something so terrifying without being sure." James swallowed, gaze drifting to the IV stand and the quiet monitors around him. "Terrifying or not, I can't just give up. Not when we've come this far." She bent forward, resting her forehead against his hand. Relief and dread mingled in her chest, a swirl of gratitude that he was still fighting, and fear of what might happen if the surgery went wrong. She felt him squeeze her fingers lightly, an unspoken reassurance that they were in this together. News traveled quickly among the family. By evening, James's parents and sister were huddled in the hospital's small cafeteria with Emily, discussing the risks. His mother's eyes brimmed with tears, and his father paced the length of the room, hands behind his back, while the sister listened in tense silence. "You're sure this is the only option?" his father pressed, voice gravelly. "We need a guarantee." Emily shook her head softly. "There are no guarantees. but Dr. Hughes believes it's the best chance James has. A hush fell, broken by the hiss of an espresso machine in the corner. James's mother looked around for support, then at last conceded. If it might save him, or at least buy real time, we can't say no. Agreeing, they all parted ways, each lost in their own private worries. Emily returned to James's side, determined to face the next hours with composure. And so the countdown began. In the sterile brightness of morning, a surgical team arrived, gently explaining what James could expect during the procedure. Emily stood by, helping him sign consent forms. Each stroke of the pen felt like stepping over a threshold. James tried for a light-hearted grin, though his trembling hand betrayed his nerves. When the time came, the orderlies wheeled James down a corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly under fluorescent lights. Emily stayed beside him as long as they let her, speaking quiet reassurances while he squeezed her hand. At the swinging doors of the operating suite, a nurse gently guided her back. "I'll see you on the other side," James said, voice tight but resolute. Emily nodded, tears threatening. "I'll be right here." Then the doors closed, leaving her alone in the hush of an empty hallway. She pressed her fist to her chest, willing herself not to crumble. She found a cramped waiting room and dropped onto a vinyl chair, mind whirling with memories. Their first kiss on a cold winter evening, the day they almost signed divorce papers, the late-night arguments, and the tender moments of the last few weeks. She realized with a jolt how life had thrust them into a space where love, pain, regret, and hope all collided. Minutes dragged into hours. Family members arrived offering coffee she couldn't bring herself to drink. The typical hospital announcements droned overhead, calling for doctors and codes, each time making her jump. She tried pacing, tried reading an old magazine, but nothing eased the gnawing tension. Finally, Dr. Hughes emerged from the operating area, mask removed, revealing lines of fatigue etched on his face. Emily shot to her feet, heart in her throat. "Doctor?" was all she managed, voice trembling. He motioned for her to follow him to a quieter alcove. "The surgery took longer than expected," he said softly. "The mass was intricate, close to important blood vessels. We removed as much as we could without causing irreversible damage. James is stable, but the next 24 hours are critical." His tone, though measured, held a note of cautious optimism. Emily's shoulders sagged in relief mixed with fresh anxiety. She thanked him repeatedly, clinging to the word stable as though it were a life raft. He walked off to update the rest of the family, leaving her to gather her composure before seeing James. When at last she was led to the recovery room, the sight of James wrapped in blankets, an array of tubes and monitors attached, nearly undid her. He was pale, eyes closed, a bandage around his head, yet she spotted the faint rise and fall of his chest, proof he was still there. "James," she whispered, settling into a chair beside his bed. She reached for his hand beneath the covers, chilled but reassuring in her grasp. He didn't stir, lost in anesthetic slumber. Emily touched his wedding band, still in place despite all their near misses. She remembered a time not so long ago when that ring felt like it belonged to another life, each of them convinced their marriage was over. Now, the idea of losing him terrified her in a way she couldn't fully articulate. She pressed her free hand against her mouth to stifle a sob, refusing to break down in front of the bustling nurses. Instead, she forced her breath to slow, inhaling the sterile hospital air. They had done everything they could. The rest was in his body's hands, and perhaps something beyond either of their control. Those first hours after surgery felt endless. Emily slept fitfully in a pull-out chair while machines beeped in steady intervals. Nurses slipped in and out, checking vitals, whispering updates. Each time James's heart rate or blood pressure rose or fell, Emily jerked awake, heart racing. But gradually, his vital signs leveled, holding steady. By morning, James groaned, eyelids fluttering. Emily shot upright, Nearly spilling the cup of lukewarm coffee on her lap, she rushed to the bedside, eyes brimming with relief. "Hey," she murmured, voice catching. "How do you feel?" He blinked slowly, trying to focus. He croaked something incoherent, then cleared his throat. The corners of his mouth twitched in an attempt at a smile. "I'm here," he rasped, as if double-checking his own survival. "You are," she agreed, pressing a gentle kiss to his fingertips. "And you made it through." He mustered the faintest nod, drifting in and out of clarity. His words came in whispers, punctuated by exhaustion and pain medication. Still, Emily heard what mattered. He recognized her. He was aware enough to ask how the surgery had gone, and he managed a small laugh when she joked about the hospital's bland food options. Dr. Hughes arrived midday, confirming that the initial signs looked promising. No immediate complications, no significant bleeding. Still, he cautioned them to remain guarded. "We'll monitor him closely for the next week," he said, "then reevaluate how the targeted therapy and any additional treatments might proceed." Emily thanked him, feeling tears slip down her cheeks for the umpteenth time. This time, they were tears of cautious hope rather than pure dread. She lingered by James's bed, whispering encouragement, telling him about each family member's messages of love and how the online fundraiser had attracted support from unexpected places. "I guess we're not doing the divorce," James murmured at one point, voice still scratchy. "Feels pointless now, doesn't it?" Emily's breath caught, remembering the stack of legal papers back at the apartment, all but forgotten. She smiled, tears glistening. "Completely pointless," she agreed, lifting his hand to her cheek. "Let's just call it off." He nodded, relieved. The weight of that decision lifted from both their shoulders, overshadowed by the immediate battle for his life. For the next several days, doctors and nurses hovered, tweaking dosages, observing his progress, and slowly, day by day, he improved, enough to start sipping bland broth and working with a physical therapist to test balance and mobility. A sense of renewal built between them, a quiet acceptance that every dawn was a victory. When the day arrived for James to be discharged, the medical team gave final instructions, scheduling follow-up scans and therapy sessions. His family, brimming with cautious joy, gathered around to help him dress. Emily held his arm as they led him out the hospital's main doors. Outside, the late afternoon sun warmed their faces, a stark contrast to the clinical chill they'd grown accustomed to. James winced at the brightness, but Emily saw his lips curve into a grin. She slipped her hand into his, feeling the weight of the wedding band on his finger, remembering the promises they'd nearly forgotten in their darkest hours. They took a few steps from the entrance, breathing in fresh air as if tasting freedom for the first time in months. Though he leaned on her slightly, James stood taller, a spark of life in his gaze. Emily pressed close, soaking up the reassuring beat of his heart. As they stepped into the sunlight, Emily and James share a relieved laugh. They have a second chance, not just at marriage, but at life. The story ends on a note of hope and renewed determination. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Just click on the screen.